Welcome back, family, to Black House Live's book lecture series. We are still discussing Dr. Amos Wilson's Blueprint for Black Power. In our last lecture, we discussed Chapter 16, Investing in and Trading with African Nations, where we looked at the short-term and long-term benefits of establishing economic and political alliances with African nations. In the last few chapters, Dr. Wilson has been juxtaposing the lack of African American economic development and juxtaposing that with the success stories of ethnic immigrant groups in America who've experienced some sort of economic prosperity. Wilson reminds us that African American relative powerlessness is not the result of Black inferiority, but has more to do with the lack of ethnic identity, ethnic solidarity, and a collective will. And so in this chapter, chapter 17, Empowerment Through Wealth, Wilson reminds us of our rich history of entrepreneurialism with the attempts at revitalizing and empowering the African community worldwide. The tradition of trade and self-help among African Americans. According to Wilson, African Americans are heirs to the longest tradition of commerce and entrepreneurialism of any group on earth. The most ancient of African civilizations was that of Ethiopia in the Nile Valley and were founded on economic systems of trade and commerce. The kingdoms of East and West Africa were based on commercial enterprise, on monopolies, and control over important economic material resources, centers of trade, and major trade routes, right? So our ancient ancestors, right, were experienced in economic systems of trade and commerce. And Wilson is making the argument, right, that if it is in our history, right, if we did it once, we can do it again. Um, Others try to make the arguments, right, that slavery eradicated this rich history. And Wilson would do much to refute that claim and refute that argument. Dr. Wilson reminds us that despite the horrors of enslavement, the business and social organizational skills, the inventive and entrepreneurial genius to which they were heirs, did not wither and die under the trauma of slavery. Wilson would provide several examples of Black entrepreneurialism that existed even during the period of American enslavement of African peoples. Race and entrepreneurship. Citing Butler, Wilson argues that the historical business experiences and traditions of commercial enterprise of Africans and American, i.e., African Americans, have been ignored in the sociology of entrepreneurship. The current discourse leads to the assumption that Afro Americans did not develop a strong business tradition. And this is something that Wilson has been adamantly arguing against in this book. Wilson argues that once the historical record is actually analyzed, it tells a totally different story, right? He makes the case that African Americans exhibited the same type of entrepreneurial spirit as other groups who migrated to this country. And so, very briefly, we're going to view a long list that Amos Wilson constructed. He created a list of historical economic milestones that African Americans achieved, right, shortly before emancipation, right after emancipation, right, and continuing up until today. We will only highlight just a few of those examples. So, starting this list of economic milestones, Wilson begins with Jean-Baptiste Dusabo, the first wholesaler, merchant, and non-indigenous settler of Chicago. He was also a businessman and capitalist. And as America began to take shape as one of the leading capitalist countries, Afro-Americans tried to carve out a business place for themselves. And so we're going to see this theme several times here in this chapter where Wilson is arguing that the development of these all Black towns, all Black cities, right, an all Black nation was not simply to get away from white repression, to get away from white terror, right? But the creation of these Black all Black towns were hopes for African people to achieve their economic objectives, right? They wanted to be economically free, they wanted to be economically liberated, and the development of these towns gave them the best chance for that. And so, according to Wilson, Afro Americans developed enterprises in almost every area of the business community prior to the Civil War, including merchandising, real estate, manufacturing, construction trades, transportation, and extractive industries. The reality of slavery was that slaves, despite acquired skill, could not become entrepreneurs in the true sense of the word. Nevertheless, the fact that some degree of Afro American entrepreneurship has been documented as existing during slavery is testament to the fact that this form of capitalism is able to exist under the most extreme conditions. Even during enslavement, African American people were able to develop entrepreneurial enterprises. Continuing with this list of economic milestones, the Negro in the South was not only proficient as a carpenter, blacksmith, shoemaker, baker, tailor, and cook, but as a result of almost 2.5 centuries of slavery up to the outbreak of the Civil War. The knowledge of these skills was concentrated almost exclusively in the hands of the Negro, free and enslaved. Much of the literal skill, the manual physical labor skill and talent was possessed by enslaved and free African American people during this time. Wilson goes on to say that in 1838, a pamphlet, perhaps the first of its kind, was published, entitled A Register of Trades of Colored People in the City of Philadelphia and Districts. It listed 656 persons engaged in 57 different occupations. The register also listed businesses which were independently run by women of African descent. Had this example not been presented here, a lot of African American people would have never believed this statement. A lot of white folks would have never believed this statement, right? We've all been socialized to believe that during enslavement, right, there was no way for Black folks to actualize their dreams, right? To step into positions like this, to have this kind of economic autonomy. Yet we see that it existed, right? Yet we see that there were some African American people who were able to carve out these realities for themselves, right? Again, speaking to the fact that the African American experience is not a homogenous experience, right? It's not a monolithic experience. All right. But according to historian August Meyer, there was a real burgeoning of Negro enterprise after 1890 and especially after 1900, though it was based more on the Negro market than were earlier enterprises. According to the National Negro Business League, the number of businesses enterprises had risen from 20,000 in the 1900s to 40,000 in 1914. In that period, banks had risen from 4 to 51, undertakers from 450 to 1,000, drugstores from 250 to 695, retail merchants from 10,000 to 25,000. And perhaps the most celebrated of these newer enterprises was that of the millionaire Madam C.J. Walker, a St. Louis laundress who invented the first successful hair straightening process. You are going to hear me bring this example up again, but in modern day, Rihanna's makeup, by choosing to create a makeup that was representative of the majority of Black and brown skin tones and melanated skin tones, that big European makeup brands, for whatever reason, chose not to develop, chose not to make, right, for those clients. Rihanna created that, tapped into that unique taste and preference of Black and brown people, and has since become a billionaire. There are even stories, right, and whispers that Rihanna's makeup company is on the verge of bankrupting, right? Many of these European makeup companies that have cornered the market for decades. Wilson talks about in this chapter, in the next few chapters as well, right, how we as strategic, critical thinkers in our community can now start to use the Black consumer in a very strategic way. We can use our consumerism in our strategic advantage. We can start to use our own preference, our own taste, right? Start to utilize those things in strategic ways, right, as a way to eliminate white domination. and white exploitation over us. Let's keep moving. Continuing on this list, right, of economic milestones, Wilson writes, W.E.B. Du Bois noted after visiting Durham, North Carolina, that there is in this city a group of 5,000 or more colored people whose social and economic development is perhaps more striking than that of any similar group in the nation. Durham began as a financial district as early as 1907, and in many publications throughout America, it was called the Wall Street of Negro America. The strength of one of its larger firms, the Mechanics and Farmer Bank, is demonstrated by the fact that it helped most, if not all, the Afro-American businesses in Durham to survive the Great Depression, a feat which the great majority of American small businesses were unable to match due to Black self-determination, right? The Mechanics and Farmer Bank that was developed by Black folks were able to help sustain Black small businesses during the Great Depression. And those Black businesses did not go under. Tulsa, the Black Promised Land. Durham, North Carolina, according to Wilson, was but a model town for African Americans to follow. Durham was duplicated across Black America. There existed a number of Black towns across the country and a large number of Black main streets in many American towns and cities where Black-owned businesses and Black professionals prospered. So again, we're seeing the example that the development of these all-Black towns, these all-Black cities, were constructed with the intentions of being places where African American people could exercise their economic objectives. They could exercise their economic will, right? And they could live in harmony with other like-minded people. One famous Black main street was Greenwood Avenue, better known as Deep Greenwood in Tulsa, Oklahoma. According to Wilson, Deep Greenwood comprised the heart of Black Tulsa's business community. It was regularly referred to by many as the Negro Wall Street. So here we see that even before Tulsa, right, many all-Black towns, right, that were prosperous, that was self-sustaining and served the needs of the Black folks in that community. For many intents and purposes, that was their Black Wall Street, because that's where those Black folks in that community would go, right, if they needed resource, if they needed assistance, if they needed support, right? And so Tulsa, Oklahoma, Deep Greenwood was not the only Black Wall Street in America, contrary to popular belief. According to Wilson, 2- and 3-story brick buildings line the avenue, housing a variety of commercial establishments, including a dry goods store, 2 theaters, groceries, confectionaries, restaurants, and billiard halls. A number of Black Tulsa's 11-room houses and 4 hotels were located here. Deep Greenwood was also a favorite place for the offices of Tulsa's unusually large number of Black lawyers, doctors, and other professionals. Wilson argues that Black Tulsa's prosperity was interrupted in May of 1921 when an exceedingly destructive race riot eventuated in the almost total burning down of its business district and surrounding neighborhoods by raging whites, inflammatory mobs, and a National Guard tactics. Black Phoenix rises from its ashes. Citing Ellsworth's Death in a Promised Land, Wilson paints the picture of Black Tulsan resilience when he writes that many of the buildings along the first block of Greenwood Avenue running north from Archer Street were rebuilt by the end of 1922. According to Ellsworth, many of these later buildings were constructed as the original ones had been, with red bricks from a local brickyard located 2 blocks north of the avenue. So even after the repression, and a lot of times what's not talked about was the resilience, right, of these Black Tulsans, right? They rebuilt their establishments. They rebuilt their businesses and organizations. They didn't go to the government with their hands out and saying, hey, you owe us, right? Which they did. They just got back to work. And we today have to be about the work. We got to get back to work, y'all. All Black towns in America. According to Dr. Wilson, ideas of establishing all Black communities, all Black states within the United States, all Black nations, especially in the Caribbean and Africa, were extremely popular amongst the African American community of the 19th century. Wilson argues that among the better known all black towns across the country were Coahuila, Alabama, Mound Bayou, Mississippi, and Belay, Oklahoma. According to Wilson, Coahuila, Alabama was established about 1897 by William Benson. A graduate of Howard University, Benson founded an industrial settlement. Again, you'll remember me saying that the creation of these all black towns, right, were not created just to escape white terror and white repression, but were meant to be created for black folks to experience their economic liberation, right? They wanted to achieve their economic objectives. And so Benson founded an industrial settlement, right, populated primarily by farmers, landowners, and skilled craftsmen, so that these business people could live amongst like-minded individuals who would be able to minister to their own and the needs of the entire community. His Dixie Industrial Company purchased large tracts of land, which is sold on easy terms to members of the community, constructed a 15-mile railroad, and operated a timber company, sawmill, and retail stores. The town's Coahuila School was designed to produce skilled farmers and mechanics, as well as good husbands and housewives rather than servants. And so the Coahuila School, right, essentially was a feeder system into the companies. There were going to be jobs for these students, for these educated students, because they had been trained and prepared to step into that workforce. Since the printing of a blueprint for Black Power, more information has since come out about Coahuila, Alabama, and it turns out that Alabama's Lake Martin is built on the previous majority Black town of Coahuila. It is home to the first Black-owned railroad started by William E. Benson and the Black school Coahuila Academic and Industrial Institute. So now we got the name of that school, right, of Coahuila. It was called the Coahuila Academic and Industrial Institute. William is the son of John Benson, who was enslaved and then freed. He went on a journey to rescue his sister in Florida, who was separated during slavery, and they made their way back to Alabama. John purchased thousands of acres of land sold to Black families, where he formed a community. William helped his dad expand the family business, and after William's death and the closing of the school, Coahuila was destroyed to make room for Lake Martin. And so what I love about the additional information, right, was that William, who was a beneficiary of his father, John had laid this groundwork. But John was born an enslaved African, right? But despite that, right, John still had hopes. He had never acquiesced his liberation. He had never acquiesced his freedom. And his son, his children, right, who too were beneficiaries of this spirit, they were able to build this town and establish this town largely because of the work that their father had instilled in them. All right. Mound Bayou, Mississippi was founded in 1887 by Isaiah T. Montgomery, former slave and staunch defender against the disenfranchisement of Black Mississippians. So you should notice a trend here of the examples that Amos Wilson chose to use here. Many of the founders of these towns, right, were ex-slaves. And so what is Wilson trying to say to us? That despite how hard the current situation may be, despite how repressive these white folks may be at any given moment in time, there are plenty of examples of history where our ancestors persevered despite how repressive the environment was. And that's the message. Charles Banks, a graduate of all-Black Rush University at Holly Springs, Mississippi, as Mound Bayou's leading merchant, founded a bank, a cottonseed oil mill, and a loan and investment company after he moved there in 1903. Besides Banks' enterprises, the town boasted a salt mill, a farmers' cooperative mercantile company, real estate ventures, a newspaper, a normal and industrial institute, and an electric power company. This is just a few years after emancipation. And here we have former enslaved African people, right, being the leaders of industries themselves. right? Since the printing of this book, more information about Mound Bayou has come out, and so I just added some of that here. Mound Bayou had a U.S. post office, 6 churches, bank stores, several public and private schools. Its economy depended on the production of cotton, timber, and corn. And just like Coahuila, Alabama, Mound Bayou was a byproduct of a railroad station. The railroad that ran through Mound Bayou brought a tons of new information, new resources, right? New services. It brought in new bodies, right? So um, Mound Bayou was in the midst, right, of the industrialization. Politically, Mound Bayou's mayor, Isaiah Montgomery, protected it from white violence through political accommodation. Socially, Mound Bayou had an exceptionally low crime rate. Which is evidenced through the fact that it is said that no gambling or the sale of alcohol was not permitted, right, in Mounds Bayou. Isaiah Montgomery, the mayor at that time, was said to be friends with Booker T. Washington, right? And through his friendship with Booker T. Washington, it afforded him to be able to procure tons of resource, right, tons of money for Mound Bayou. Through outlets like the town's newspaper, The Demonstrator, Mound Bayou promoted education as an essential path to community survival, in particular vocational education and scientific agriculture through the Mound Bayou Normal and Industrial Institute. Remember, the mayor was friends, right, with Booker T. Washington. And thus, it would stand to reason that the educational philosophy of that school would be one that was similar to that of Booker T. Washington's. Its noticeable decline occurred during the Great Migration period of 1915 to 1930, in which cotton prices fell. Booker T. Washington passed away, and the Black path toward freedom was redirected from independent towns toward the major cities of the United States. And so once Mound Bayou lost its support in Booker T. Washington due to his untimely demise, Mound Bayou, unfortunately, didn't exist in the way that it once did. However, despite the sharp population decline throughout the century, Mound Bayou still exists today as a predominantly Black town in Mississippi with a 98.6% total Black population. So whereas Coahuila today currently sits underwater, right, under Lake Martin, uh, Mound Bayou, Mississippi is a 98.6% Black town in Mississippi. Bolay, Oklahoma. Bolay was also among the earliest of some 25 all-Black towns founded in 1898 in America. In 1914, Bolay boasted of a $150,000 high school, cement sidewalks, attractive residents, a Masonic temple, electric power plant and waterworks, and 82 business concerns, including a bank, 3 cotton gins, and a telephone system. Wilson argues that the story of Tulsa is the story of Black American entrepreneur triumph and tragedy. It is a story now almost forgotten in America. The entrepreneurial spirit of Black Tulsa, Durham, Atlanta, Philadelphia, Chicago, Kansas City, and many other pre-Great Depression Black main streets across the nation must be rediscovered and revived if the African American community is to realize its economic and political power. Right? Much like our ancestors who were seeking to experience and achieve their economic objectives, we too, the descendants of those ancestors, we must be just as adamant and just as urgent about actualizing our economic objectives. Early African American investment in Africa, the case of Marcus Garvey. According to Dr. Wilson, just as Europeans saw America as a location for investment and resettlement, many African Americans perceive Africa as a place for resettlement and investment. According to Wilson, this ideal was best expressed in the life of Marcus Garvey and his attempts to resettle African Americans in Liberia and initiate economic trade relations between the continental African nations and the African American community. We discussed this thoroughly in the last lecture on Chapter 16, Investing in and Trading with African Nations. In 1920, Marcus Garvey, as head of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, the UNIA, set in motion a plan to colonize Liberia and to establish trade relations with that African nation, then founded as a locale for resettlement of Black Americans in Africa under the support of the United States. And so for Marcus Garvey, right, he wanted to resettle Africans in Liberia right? He wanted to establish a trade network, right, between African Americans and America, right, and Africans in Liberia. This here destroys the argument that Marcus African American people to relocate back to Africa. While that could have been an eventual goal, right? After the mass liberation of all African people, right, in the West, I don't think that that was ever a goal of Marcus Garvey, right? To colonize Liberia and to establish trade relations with that African nation, right? Um, and for Africans who saw Africa as a viable place to resettle, who has something to contribute, right, to this equation, right? Uh, Garvey recognized that there were going to be African Americans who needed to remain in America, right, in order for the trade network to be established, right? According to Dr. Wilson, the idea of blacks moving to areas where they would possess an independent state, a state where they could escape the psychosocial, political, and economic ill effects of endemic white American racism and enjoy life as a free people was not merely confined to overseas locations such as the Caribbean and Africa. Many sought to found independent all black towns and states in America. Many of such towns were established, and an attempt to create an all black state in Oklahoma Territory in the 1890s was vigorously pursued by a number of black leaders and organizations. Wilson argues that the motive for the desire of many blacks to migrate or immigrate to all black towns, states, and nations was not merely to escape adverse political or social conditions, but that in many instances, economic motives predominated. Nationalistic sentiments, the desire to found economically and culturally great nations, were inextricably intertwined with other social and economic drives. And so it was not solely trying to escape white terrorism and white repression, right? That triggered African calls, right, to have their own cities, their own states, their own nations, right? But it was also a result of our economic desires and our nationalistic desires as well. The UNIA and African American Continental African Trade Relations. According to Dr. Wilson, Amy Jaquez Garvey, Garvey's widow, in her book Garvey and Garveyism, writes the following about Garvey's attempts to colonize and trade with Liberia. In a letter dated June 8, 1920, addressed to the Honorable C. King, President of Liberia, Mr. Garvey stated that the purpose of his mission was to establish trade routes through a line of steamships, to encourage immigration to build up the country, to transfer its headquarters to Liberia, and to bring with it medical and scientific units. Therefore, the organization asks for written assurances that every facility will be given it, to procure lands for business, agriculture, and industrial purposes. In return, the organization with its vast membership will lend financial and moral support to the government to help her out of her present economic plight. According to Wilson, Garvey achieved his Liberian objectives. The UNIA sent a delegation of 6 persons to Liberia after receiving a favorable reply from Liberia's Secretary of State. This delegation included an agricultural officer, surveyor, pharmacist, and builder. They carried machinery and supplies with them and were recipients of subsequent shipments. They were later joined by many other UNIA members. And in December of 1923, another delegation was sent to Liberia to make arrangements for a full-scale colonization program and to work out further details of trade, commerce, and resettlement. There were arguments that Garvey wanted all African people in the diaspora to move back to Africa. And these 2 slides here just goes to prove that this was not the case. Garvey recognized that we needed Africans throughout the diaspora so that these African nations could trade with other Africans around the world, right? Garvey recognized then, right, that Africans were not incorporated into the world market in the same way that all other groups of people were. And thus, Africans in America, there were going to be needed a base of employed, business-minded African Americans to remain in the Americas to trade with the African nations. Black nationalism and African American trade relations. Dr. Wilson argues that Marcus Garvey is a shining example for contemporary Black nationalists. Wilson argues that the acceptance, elaboration, and realization of these initiatives are crucial to African American and Pan African liberation, our survival, prosperity, and power as they have always been. The need for African based trade, economic, and cultural cooperation cannot be overstated, right? The keys to our African American liberation lies in African and African American people developing the trade infrastructure necessary, right, to lay the path for our economic liberation. According to Dr. Wilson, in order for liberating, enriching, and empowering trade, economic, and cultural relations to take place, African American leadership like Marcus Garvey must be rediscovered, revitalized, and refurbished by the contemporary African leadership and community. The success of continental African and African American trade relations depends to a significant on the colonization of Africa by segments of the African American community and vice versa with regard to continental Africans. So African American people have to be thinking about relocating to Africa, establishing businesses in Africa, buying up blocks, right, in Africa, right? And we need African brothers and sisters, right, on the continent to be thinking about how they can relocate to the Americas, right, establish businesses right, and residency in African American communities, right? We have to create these highways. Wilson argues that African American community and the community of African nations can mutually accelerate and motivate each other's economies in ways similar to the mutual growth and the development of the economies of Western Europe and the United States. We discussed in our last lecture, chapter 16, how Europe invested in the United States, right, when it was just the small 13 colonies, and that without that European investment, America would never have been able to grow, right? And Wilson makes that comparison to say that in the same way that Europe supported the development of the United States, African Americans and Africans throughout the diaspora must invest in African nations similarly. Repression of African American economic power. According to Dr. Wilson, one of the most important and potent sources of social power is access to and control over economic resources. Wilson argues that the relative powerlessness of African Americans is directly related to their relative lack of control over important economic resources. Wilson reminds us that this lack is neither due to the absence of an entrepreneurial tradition nor an absence of economic virtues. According to Wilson, the relative weakness of African American enterprise has been deliberately induced and maintained by a number of concrete socioeconomic, socio-political actions taken against their economic growth. Black folks didn't just wake up one day in the economic dire situation that we find ourselves in currently, right? This is a byproduct of a concerted effort, right? Psychosocial, social economic campaigns that have been instigated against African American people. But Wilson goes hard. He says that the blame lies at the feet of three major groups: white Americans, immigrants, and blacks themselves, particularly the black leadership. There's a whole chapter dedicated to the crisis of black leadership. It's the last chapter of the book, chapter 31. We will also lecture on that chapter as well. According to Dr. Wilson, in the study of early African American entrepreneurial history, reveals that when Black business persons were permitted relatively free access to full American markets, i.e., allowed to develop clientele from all racial groups, many of their businesses prospered. Moreover, African Americans gained a number of economic niches and monopolized a number of trade service areas in the American marketplace. When allowed to compete, we dominate, right? We overexceed. Right, and one could argue that that is one of the reasons why we have been excluded and left out, because to allow us in, you will have to compete with us. Citing Butler, Wilson argues that the system of segregation was implemented and applied exclusively to Afro-Americans, which controlled their every movement. Wilson argues that this governmental control took away the opportunity for Afro-American businesses to compete in a truly open market. This is one of the fundamental differences between Afro-American businesses and ethnic American businesses. For example, while the Japanese in California were able to develop a white clientele, Afro-Americans were forced to find clients from within their own communities. So Wilson has been making this argument for several chapters now that African Americans have never had access to America's quote unquote open and free markets. America's open and free markets have never been open and free to Black business folk. Citing Harold Cruse, Wilson argues that the deliberate, though most often covert restriction, undermining, and destruction of Black businesses and economic progress in no small way has contributed to the lowering of Black business self-esteem and self-confidence, even the loss of confidence in Black business acumen and professionalism. The fear of taking business risks by Blacks and their relative lack of faith that their business enterprises will be supported by their Black customers, let alone white customers, right? And so, citing Harold Cruse here, Wilson is arguing that the campaign, the deliberate, covert, and overt campaign to destroy Black economics is the result of the lowering of Black business self-esteem. Is the lowering of the Black self-confidence in themselves in developing businesses, or that someone is going to actually support and invest in their businesses, right? Wilson argues that enslavement resulted in the lowering and in some cases the loss of confidence in Black business acumen and professionalism, and the fear of taking risks, but not loss of the knowledge itself. Immigration and Black economic stagnation. According to Dr. Wilson, immigration in many instances operated against the job and business opportunities of African Americans. As discussed in Chapter 14, we discussed the benefits and the cost of immigration to the Black community. Wilson explained that in collusion with and often stimulated by the regressive white racist governmental laws and social practices, immigrants often dislodged and replaced African American labor and business persons. Wilson argues that immigrants most often did not internalize and express the same racist attitudes towards Blacks as did and still do native racist whites. Wilson is arguing that racist white business folks, right, and naive ethnic immigrants colluded to discriminate against African American businessmen and women. Citing Graham and Beck, Wilson argues that through networking, recent immigrants achieve positions of authority within a business and begin to recruit relatives, friends, and acquaintances from their country of origin. Wages and working conditions often stagnate or decline in the firm. Often the language of the workplace changes from English. Blacks effectively are barred from employment. Additionally, affirmative action and other remedies, which were originally intended to redress 2 centuries of exploitation of and discrimination against Blacks, now must be shared with recently arrived foreign-born populations, discussed in other chapters as affirmative action with a vengeance, right? And so Wilson has been arguing and is arguing here, right, that when many ethnic immigrants get promoted onto a job or hired onto a job, right, and they have some type of authority, some type of leadership position, right? They start to hire their own relatives. They start to replace the other folks there. Language starts to change, and this disproportionately impacts Black employees. According to Dr. Wilson, Black loyalty to America has yielded very little results. Wilson argues that after having their labor production expropriated through slavery and criminally low wages and the joining and fighting in all of America's wars from the Revolutionary War onwards, the African American community has been excluded from full participation in the American market economy. Wilson argues that the loyalty of African Americans to this country for centuries has apparently not earned them enough credits to step to the head of the line in front of immigrants who not only recently got off the boat, but many of whom at one point in time may have been active enemies of the U.S. And here is a point not often reconciled by a lot of Black leadership and dealt with Black leadership. Too often do we see liberals jumping on the bandwagon of supporting immigration and the reason why America needs to support immigration, right? And why minorities should support immigration and things of that nature. Wilson is saying that in many instances, some of those immigrants were just recently fighting against the United States. They were the opposition to the United States and yet can come over to this country and receive loans and receive jobs, right? Receive assistance in ways that African American citizens cannot and have not. Wilson argues in that last slide that we were just looking at that affirmative action, a law that was meant to address the historical ways in which African American people have been discriminated against and excluded, was now forced to be shared amongst all people of color in America. And so Wilson has been making this argument for the last few chapters to African people, African American people, to analyze, right, both the benefits as well as the cost of immigration to our community. So it's not just that white folks have excluded us from competing in their markets, right? But it is also the colluded work of naive immigrants. Blacks as immigrants. Dr. Wilson argues that to compare African American economic efforts or the lack thereof is unfair and disingenuous. Citing a 1992 study of the Wall Street Journal, says the difference in favor of non-blacks in terms of economic progress is attributed to their willingness to work long hours, right? Those immigrants, to work 2 or 3 low-wage jobs, said immigrants. They save their money and invest it in business, right? These are the theories, right, as to the behavior and the characteristics that lend themselves to immigrants being successful in this country. The use of common ethnic contacts to obtain credit, advice, and patronage, to do business with their own, hire their own. They have strong economic solidarity, a strong desire for education. But Wilson argues what is forgotten when these comparisons are made is the fact that African Americans exhibited these same characteristics well into the 1900s. So when we look at it, these characteristics are not specific to Asians or any other immigrant group, but are just behaviors, right, of recent immigrants to any country. Furthermore, Wilson argues African Americans are not immigrants. They are native born. And according to Wilson, native born groups of any race do not exhibit the same entrepreneurial drive characteristics of new immigrants, right? So to compare third, fourth, fifth, sixth generation groups of people, right, to groups of recently immigrated folks to that country, Wilson is saying that that's a disingenuous comparison. And the folks that are doing the comparisons know this, they know these facts, right? When the currently celebrated immigrants become third or fourth generation Americans, new immigrants from their own ethnic stock will likely surpass them in entrepreneurial drive, right? So as new immigrants become situated in the country that they're in, and they start to have children and children and children, right? The more recent immigrants that come to the country will surpass those fifth, sixth, seventh generation, right, ethnic immigrants. So Wilson argues that white liberal propaganda of the 70s, 80s, and 90s relegates blacks to being just another immigrant group. Wilson goes on to argue that to compare African Americans to immigrants is to compare apples to oranges. No immigrant group, no matter how long its status may have been during its early history in America, were ever enslaved for well over 200 years. Right? We talked about it previously. No other group movements were controlled and relegated and stagnated in the same way that African Americans' movements have been monitored in this society, right? And so the relations of Black Americans to white Americans are essentially reproduced and Black Americans' relationships to other ethnic Americans, including newly arrived immigrants such as Korean Americans, Black Americans, right, are segregated, racially isolated, and ghettoized relative to other non-white ethnic groups. So in the same way that white folks don't want to live around Black people, right, they have helped to condition the world's ethnic groups, right, that when they come over to America, they don't want to live in Black neighborhoods and Black communities either. They don't want to work with Black folks either. They don't want to hire Black folks either, right? Black American communities as economic brothels. What does that mean? Black American communities as economic brothels. According to Wilson, the Black urban ghettos and the Black suburban ghettos, for Wilson, he argues that in Black suburban ghettos, are no more, they no more control the wealth in the suburb. Blacks no more control the wealth in the suburbs or control the resources of businesses of their communities in the suburb than inner city Black folks do. Contrary to their mythical thinking, Wilson argues that the Black ghetto and this Black suburban ghetto are essentially economic brothels. An economic brothel is where the white American community, in alliance with immigrant communities, exploitatively achieve a good deal of economic satisfaction at the expense of African American community. The intense consumer orientedness and entrepreneurial non competitiveness of the African American community makes it a perfect target for economic and labor exploitation and resource drainage, right? The fact that we are unable to compete, right, with that white corporate elite class that we talked about earlier allows us to be manipulated, right, into merely being consumers. All right. And now with the metrics and the data being the way that it is, right, these same folks now can dictate and predict how much money is going to come out of which Black community every single year. The intense consumer orientedness and entrepreneurial non-competitiveness of the African American community makes it a perfect target for economic and labor exploitation, right? When you don't control your own businesses and you can't hire your own people, right? We can provide you jobs, but we'll pay you whatever we want to. So we can exploit your labor and drain your resources. Citing Fussfeld and Bates, Wilson argues that the entire economy outside of the ghetto benefits from the income, capital, and manpower resources that are drawn out, just as it benefits from a pool of low-wage labor that provides relatively low-cost services to those outside. Wilson is saying African American people, Black folks, we have no friends outside of our community, y'all. We have no friends outside of our community. Wilson reintroduces the idea of the Black community as a third world nation, one encapsulated within a first world nation. The source of its economic, political, and social problems would be more apparent when viewed in this context. According to Wilson, the issue for African American people is our refusal to understand and see ourselves as a nation within a nation, right? Wilson argues that the reversal of Black ghetto deterioration, economic decline, and collapse requires that it must, in no uncertain terms, capture and control its economic infrastructure, eject foreign immigrant owners and controllers of its internal economy from its midst. We got to get non-Black business owners, right, out of our community. If they're not hiring our own people, right, if they're not investing into the community in which they reside, then they got to go, right? It must be it must retard its capital flow outward, retard the outflow of its human resources, and circulate those resources within its border as many times as possible before they flow out. In addition, the African American community must at least balance its trade with a trade surplus by earning more from trade with the larger community and world community, by selling goods and services to those outside communities, and returning, spending, saving, and investing that outside earned income with its own confines. This requires a deep and abiding sense of ethnic identification, a healthy degree of ethnic selfishness and self-centeredness, ethnic pride and high self-esteem and self-confidence, ethnically based economic aggressiveness and acumen, all justified and rationalized by an appropriate ethnic ideology, right? So Wilson is saying that in order for us to develop the alliances that we need to, in order for us to develop the infrastructure that we need to, right, we're going to have to be selfish. We're going to have to be ethnically selfish, ethnically self-centered, right, and start to think about self. We have been told by other people that it is wrong for us to prioritize self, and Wilson is telling us that we can no longer afford, right, to prioritize all other groups of people's interests over our own. Black American communities as economic brothels. According to Wilson, the traditions of African economic development only needs to be resuscitated and expressed. They have only been repressed, not extinguished. I'll say that again. According to Wilson, the traditions of African economic development, it only needs to be resuscitated and expressed. They have only been repressed, not extinguished, right? So we just need to revive those aspects of our economic personality. The Black bourgeoisie's repression of Black entrepreneurialism. According to Dr. Wilson, while immigration, restrictive governmental laws, trade restrictions, and white racist social practices goes a long way in explaining the reasons for the repression of African American entrepreneurialism, Wilson argues that there are other reasons that are just as repressive. One being the regressive Black bourgeoisie leadership establishment being held mentally captive to an anti-African assimilationist ideology. This leadership, according to Wilson, is typified by the NAACP, the Urban League, the late Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Jesse Jackson, and a long list of Black preachers, politicians, intellectuals, and professionals who neither advocate nor aggressively present an economic program for the African American community, but actively fight against such programs. They seem to perceive the problems facing the Black community as essentially problems having to do with civil rights, human rights, and moral turpitudes, i.e., the failure of America to live up to its highly publicized moral, constitutional, political, and civic values, right? Anti-Black nationalism. Wilson goes on to argue that the assimilationist, integrationist Black bourgeoisie leadership, which essentially reduces all the racial, economic subordination, and exploitation of African Americans to race discrimination in employment, public and private accommodations, vehemently oppose the self-help economic ideologies of Booker T. Washington, Marcus Garvey, and those who preceded and followed them, popularly known as Black nationalists. The Black bourgeoisie antipathy for Black nationalism, and for those who support Black self-help, Black economic self-control, aggressive Black entrepreneurship, and Black identity, consciousness, and power is legendary. This leadership evinces a fundamental and self-defeated ambivalence. It promotes Black identity and solidarity in support of its programs aimed at submerging and obliterating that very identity and solidarity while in the process of achieving complete racial assimilation into white mainstream and its bloodstream, right? These the civil rights leadership, Wilson is arguing, sought to assimilate itself into white America, whereas Black nationalists sought to create, right, for itself. They wanted to create a world for itself. And that is the major difference, then as well as now. Wilson argues that unless and until the Black community rids itself of its dominant assimilationist leadership establishment and institutes a new race-conscious, race-first leadership, which will facilitate its acquisition of economic self-control and considerable ownership of America itself, it will continue to suffer relative powerlessness and perhaps in the near future, biological annihilation. Wilson is saying, right, that until we, as an African American community, replace this problematic leadership that continues to allow white domination and white exploitation of our community, we are going to continue to be powerless, right? And Wilson argues it may eventually lead to Black annihilation. Brothers and sisters, I want to thank you for joining us in this lecture today. Our next lecture will be on chapter 21, A Nation Inside a Nation. A nation within a nation, right? Where Wilson is arguing that the African American community is essentially a third world nation. All right. I look forward to seeing you in our next lecture in chapter 21. Peace, family.